There's no question that animals communicate. Whales can sing and monkeys use alarm calls, but only humans have full-blown symbolic language. So how did we get here? In The Language Puzzle, archaeologist Steven Mithen tries to figure out how we became such a talkative species. This is BookLab. Welcome to episode 38 of BookLab, the podcast where we check out what's new in the world of popular science books. I'm your host, Dan Falk.
And I'm your other host, Amanda Gefter.
Let's face it, humans love to talk. I'm talking to you right now. But where did all this jibber-jabber come from? In his new book, Steven Mithen guides the reader through more than 1,000,000 years of hominin evolution in search of an answer.
And what do animals, plants, and machines have in common? According to James Bridle's book, Ways of Being, science is finally coming to grips with the idea that intelligence might be more widespread than we usually imagine.
And as human beings, we're burdened with the knowledge that we're going to die. But what about other animals? What do they think about death? That's the fascinating subject of philosopher Susana Monsó's new book, Playing Possum.
That's coming up in the second part of the show, where Dan and I talk about some of the science books that are on our nightstands.
But first, the language puzzle. Our first book is The Language Puzzle, piecing together the 6,000,000-year story of how words evolved. The author is Steven Mithen. He's a professor of early prehistory at the University of Reading in England. He's the author of a number of previous books. I'll just mention one that I did actually read, which was called The Prehistory of the Mind, The Cognitive Origins of Art and Science, which I highly recommend, but it is now a somewhat older book. It actually is from the 1990s. But this new book is very interesting, and the subject matter is exactly what it sounds like. It's telling the story through 6,000,000 years of history. If you're wondering what happened 6,000,000 years ago, that's approximately when humans and chimpanzees, our closest living relative, went our separate ways on the tree of life, so to speak. And the story from that point until today, the story of how language, this thing that Amanda and I are using right this minute, the thing that the listener is using to interpret the words that we're saying, how did this come to be? How is it that we became such a talkative species? Now, there have been, I would say, quite a few previous books on this subject. Steven Pinker has written popular books on how language developed. It's not so much that it breaks new ground in that sense, but it's extremely thorough. Mithen draws on current findings from a bunch of different fields, including linguistics, archaeology, anthropology, psychology, and also genetics. This is a very thoroughly researched book, and Mithen has a lot to say about this question of how language came to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big, ambitious book for sure. I mean, one of the things I found super interesting is that right off the bat, Mithen pretty strongly disagrees with Pinker. I mean, you mentioned Pinker is like one of the people who's really written about this topic, and Pinker comes from a line of Noam Chomsky and Chomsky's way of thinking about language, where he thought, there's some specialized area in the brain and maybe it's genetic, and that we have this sort of universal grammar like built into us that allows us to learn language. So from very early in the book, he sort of dismisses the kind of Chomsky Pinker way of thinking about language, and really takes a position on that this book is going to give us a different story.
Yeah, and what a intricate story it is. One section that I thought I would just highlight is the comparison between us, Homo sapiens, and the chimpanzees, because you could very well ask, how come the chimpanzees didn't learn to talk, so to speak? I mean, if talking is so great, why don't our primate cousins do it? So Mithen explains that chimps do vocalize, which, I mean, if you've been to a zoo, then you've heard chimps making these vocalizations. So they make sounds, but the sounds are not words, although Mithen does allow that they have word-like qualities. Other important differences too. I mean, so there are many distinct anatomical differences between humans and chimps that hamper a chimp's ability to produce nuanced speech. So we can get into that if we have to about, larynx, vocal tract, that sort of thing. But ultimately, Mython says that the key differences between us and chimps are cognitive, and I think that's really interesting. So it's not just, I mean, there have been, how shall we say, awkward experiments in which humans try to teach monkeys or chimps to talk, and they're not designed for talking. So that's just not going to go well. But that's not the big stumbling block. The big stumbling block is what's going on in their heads. And even if I say that, Amanda, as I say that, I know you're going to have like some issues with that. But ultimately, according to Mithen, it's not just that they have different hardware; they're also wired up. There's cognitive differences, and that's kind of why, I mean, grossly oversimplifying, but that's why we talk and the chimps don't.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting paths to go down here. I mean, one thing I found just super interesting is he sort of starts by saying, "Oh, chimps, they just sort of like grunt and pant, right?" But I don't know. It reminded me of in my household, we make jokes sometimes that like that the cat must just think we meow at each other like constantly,
That's funny.
um, and it's like, of course, to us, it just sounds like grunting and panting, right? Like we don't know what they're saying, and then Mython, talks about these experiments that people did where I forget the exact details, but it's like there's an apple on the ground, and the chimp finds the apple and makes a particular grunt, and then they record it, and then later they play that grunt, and the other chimps come out and start looking on the ground where there would be an apple. So it's like
Mm.
not it showed that it wasn't just like a generic grunt. It like
Yeah.
held some meaning to the other
Yes.
chimps. And so they've done a number of these types of experiments where they record things in a known context, and then play it back and see what happens. And it does seem to suggest that, like, you know uh, as Mython puts it, like maybe they don't have full-blown language, but what sounds to us like just grunts and pants obviously means something more to the chimps. So there's like a
Mm.
funny thing there where you're like, yeah, I mean, they don't have human language, but
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
they're just doing their own thing. So that's a really interesting question. And then, yeah, the question of like the sort of anatomical and physiological differences. Mython talks about this idea that, even just the evolution of standing upright on two legs, but having to balance a very heavy brain on our
Hmm.
shoulders, shaped our vocal tract. And like things like that maybe weren't about language to begin with could have strongly shaped or facilitated the emergence of language. And we do have slightly different anatomy than the chimps do. One of the things that he points out is that when we make an utterance, like say a sentence, we can say a number of words or sounds or syllables all on one breath.
Yes.
Whereas a chimp, just based on their anatomy, they can only make one sound per air movement. I think unlike
Mm.
us, they can talk on the inhale and on the exhale.
Mm.
Um, but they can only make one sound per breath. And that actually like makes a big difference, and possibly, a big part of language in humans is like turn taking.
Yeah.
And I think like where we take a breath is how we let someone know, okay, now it's your turn to speak. And if you had to take a breath after every syllable, like that sort of, might impact the ability to have turn taking in the first place. So there's a lot to unpack there.
So Mython talks about theory of mind. Now, I'm sure this has come up in previous episodes. So psychologists talk about the idea that a creature knows what another creature is thinking. I say creature because this also applies to humans, and that those thoughts may be different from their own, right? So this is something that very young children don't have. Human children develop this by around age 4. But the evidence suggests that chimpanzees do not have this, or at least do not have it in any substantial sense. And you might think, well, okay, so but how big a deal is that? But it's related to all kinds of other tasks, and a huge one is cooperation. So it's one thing to know that there are some juicy berries over behind that rock, but it matters whether your mates know it or don't know it, and especially if they're from another tribe or another social group, you might prefer for them not to know it. If it's your friends and you hope that they can carry the grapes back to where you are, so so there are certain situations in which you want this knowledge to spread, certain situations where you don't. But in all of these cases, it's critically important that you have some concept of the other person's knowledge. You can't just assume that there's like knowledge with a capital K and some people have it and some don't. It's critically important that some beings have distinct knowledge from other beings. So anyway, I don't mean to spend too much time talking about that, but theory of mind and this ability to cooperate are related. And just to give another quick example of this, there's this issue of the ability to abstract, to talk about things that are beyond the stuff that's right in front of you. So it's one thing to talk about a coconut or something that you and your mates can see because it's in front of you. But what if you want to talk about an antelope, in the abstract? Like it's not, an antelope isn't attacking you right now or stealing your food right now, but you want to talk about, the possibility of an antelope appearing. Now you have a much more difficult task because you can't just indicate the thing, point. I don't know how much chimpanzees actually point, but you know what I mean. You have to get your mates to understand that you're referring to a thing that is not immediately in front of them. I think Mithen refers to this as displacement. And related to this is the ability to envision the past and the future, especially the future. That's important. So being able to conceptualize stuff that is not right with you there in space or not right with you there in time. And Mithen presents kind of an argument that this is one of the things that chimps are missing. So this is one of the, I hate to say barriers, but this is one of the barriers to chimps just having a good old conversation like we're having.
See, this is another one where I found this like slightly problematic. I mean, or at least like questionable, because Mythen gives this example of chimps that give different alarm calls for different dangers. So they might make like a certain sound if there's a snake, let's say.
Yeah.
And that, tells the other chimps, what to do. Like, should you duck? Should you climb a tree? Whatever. But there are certain cases where making that alarm call in the moment could make the situation worse, right? You could be like drawing the predator near. And so there are times where the chimp will wait until the danger has moved along to tell the rest of the chimps about it. So it will make the same alarm call that means, snake when the snake is not directly there. But then Mython sort of says like, something like, well, but is this really displacement or is it just like an instinctual behavior or something? Right. And it's one of these things, like we do this with animal studies a lot. It's like we want them to do the thing that seems very human, but then when they do that thing, we say like, well, but it probably doesn't mean
well. This is and we're going to get to this in my nightstand book too, because all of this stuff comes up just exactly as you said. Like, you don't want to assume that the animal has cognitive abilities that it doesn't have, but you also don't want to assume that it doesn't have cognitive abilities that perhaps it does have. So it's very delicate. So we've talked a little bit about chimpanzees, our closest living relative. Mython spends a fair bit of time talking about other hominins. Well, of course, at the moment, Homo sapiens are the sole surviving hominin, so that there aren't any others now. But there used to be a bunch. And most recently, of course, that would have been the Neanderthals. Neanderthals came on the scene, well, it's a bit fuzzy actually, but around 500,000 years ago. It might have been 400,000. I mean, there's error bars on these numbers. And then they stuck around until just a few tens of thousands of years ago. The bottom line is that for many tens of thousands of years, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals shared the landscape. We lived side by side in certain parts of Europe and Asia. Now, there are distinctions between humans and Neanderthals, and Mythen points to some of these. Now, I think we've talked about this a little bit in previous episodes, although I do not remember which episode or which book we were talking about. But, there's this endless debate. Actually, I think I do remember. I think it was when you reviewed either Superior or Inferior, the one that talked about alleged
Oh,
racial differences.
inferior, I think.
Inferior, yeah.
Journalist Angela Saini wrote a book called Inferior and also a book called Superior. It was actually Superior that Amanda reviewed in episode 24.
And we talked a little bit about whether Neanderthals were dim-witted cave dwellers or really advanced entities who were almost human. So that sort of comes up again here. And I don't think Mythen means any disrespect to our Neanderthal friends, but he does point out that they did not display much innovation, like at all, hardly, in terms of tool use. So they used very similar tool designs for almost 300,000 years. And again, I'm not saying if I was there, I would have invented a better kind of, it's hard to talk about this without making it sound like I'm saying those dim-witted, low forehead, bungling idiots, as if I would have been better at cutting up a hyena to eat it or something, or running away from a
I mean, our
wild boar.
ancestors were happy to sleep with them, so they couldn't have been bad.
Yeah. Um, okay, so not very much stone tool innovation. And then Mythen points out, so there's this big question, what kind of language did the Neanderthals have, if any? But if the chimps had, little vestiges or glimmers of language-like abilities, then it would be crazy to think that hominins had less. So, there's a certain minimum amount that we can presume they must have had. Um, and again, Mythen points to this issue of the capacity for abstraction, which we certainly have. We just use it all the time, so you don't even think about it, right? I mean, I can talk about 3 bears or 6 bears, but I can also just talk about the idea of bears, right? And so he argues that perhaps Neanderthals just, they lacked metaphor, he suggests. Again, it gets down to what we were saying before about chimps. The how, can you talk about stuff even if it's not there in front of you? And he says, by comparison, early humans had a much more fluid language. I mean, it's awfully hard to prove any of this stuff, but Mythen puts together what feels like a plausible argument. So again, an example would be early Homo sapiens could compare two things to each other, even though they're not right there. Our ancestors could say, I mean, obviously they weren't speaking English, but it would be something along the lines of, yeah, the gazelle that Bob killed on Thursday. I mean, I know they wouldn't have said Thursday, but the gazelle that
Or
Bob killed on
Bob.
Thursday was as ferocious as the bear that Thag encountered the day before, right? So, something like that, which, according to Mythen, and again, it seems plausible, an earlier hominin or a non-human primate like a chimpanzee simply could not do. It would just be beyond their cognitive ability. So, I mean, again, there's a lot, like, is everything Mythen says correct about this? I mean, I don't know, but there's a lot of
No one knows.
no, yeah. I mean, but he
Yeah.
doesn't pull it out of nowhere. It is all based on lots and lots and lots of published studies from those different fields that I mentioned earlier. And I don't know. I mean, it sounds like I don't know. It sounds reasonable.
I mean, he does it. The sort of metaphor driving the whole book is that the language puzzle is like a jigsaw puzzle, right? And so you have all these pieces coming from different fields, and he does do a great job of that, right? So it's like obviously there's no words in the fossil record, right? And so
Yeah.
we don't know what they could have said, but you can look at their anatomy and like what kinds of sounds they could have made, and then you can look at the art on the cave wall, and then you get a sense
Yes.
of, is there symbolic metaphorical thinking, and then the tool use and fire and all these things, and just pulling evidence from all these different strands and then constructing this story, which, like, again, like, no one really knows, but he does do a great job of sort of pulling together all these different types of evidence to give a picture.
Yeah, let me give one more example because we've been on this topic of, cognitive or alleged cognitive differences between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. An interesting case is humor. And, of course, today in the 2025, to think about what year it is, but in 2025, we crack jokes all the time. Could be a little bit challenging in these times that we live in, but, humor is just with us everywhere you look. Let me just quote this one sentence or two sentences from Mithen. He writes, puns, double entendres, and innuendos, all reliant on metaphor and the verbal fluency of the modern mind, now pervade language. These gave modern humans a joy of words that remained absent among the domain-specific Neanderthals. Homo sapiens laughed their way into modernity. Now, that I love that last line. I mean,
Yeah,
it's a
that's great.
little, cheesy or whatever, but I love that that kind of that way of putting things. It seems reasonable that while Neanderthals might have had the occasional guffaw or the occasional haha moment, I mean, I'm thinking of like the simplest kind, like the Marx Brothers. Now I'm going to get an angry email from someone. No, the Marx Brothers were incredibly sophisticated. How could you think of them as primitive? But hopefully you see what I'm getting at. Like
They
kind of
just did like some good slapstick comedy.
slapstick, like pretending to push someone when you're not really pushing them. I mean, that's not the
I
kind of thing
love
you'd want to
picturing
get
the
misunderstood.
Neanderthals too.
Right. Well, I don't know, but I can more readily
A
um,
whoopee cushion.
well, look, I've been watching the BBC. I have this 40 DVD set of the complete Shakespeare from the BBC, and there's a lot of so-called humor in Shakespeare that I'm sure the Neanderthals were not doing because it's kind of involved. Like where Hamlet says, "Oh, you can play the flute, and now you think you can play me like the flute." Like it's this is nobody was saying that 400,000 years ago, I surmise. So anyway, I think this is really interesting. Like, yeah, did humor get us into the modern age? Well, probably not by itself, but I love reading these kinds of educated speculations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that really stood out to me in this book is, we think of language as being so abstract and so symbolic. But by bringing in all this kind of concrete evidence, you start to see language as something much more concrete as well. So, just as an example, um, Mython talks about hunter-gatherers versus farming communities and the languages that developed in those very different lifestyles. And he basically shows that because hunter-gatherers have to eat like food that's much harder to chew than like farming communities where they are growing like grains and things that are like softer when you prepare them to eat. That basically like we have, evidence that the hunter gatherers had a very different bite. Like their teeth were worn down more.
Hmm.
And because of that, it would be much harder to make certain sounds like an F sound or a V sound where the lower lip has to push against your upper teeth. Like they just didn't have a bite that supported that very well. And then those languages that came out of like the hunter-gatherer communities don't have those sounds, or have far, far fewer of those sounds. And so there's all these like interesting connections between, like even today, he says there's a population in South Africa that genetically tends to have smaller, like bony ridges behind their teeth. And so they can very quickly, with very minimal effort, make like a clicking sound with their tongue or
Mhm.
their they can make very effortlessly make this clicking sound. And so they have a language that uses clicks as consonants, which I spent a bit of time in South Africa, and I remember walking into a grocery store and hearing two women speaking, and they were using a lot of clicks, and it was remarkable to listen to. But yeah, like these things like diet and dental issues and whatnot,
Yeah.
can play a role in really shaping um how we use language, but even like the meanings of language. I mean, I think that's a big thing that comes out in the book is the meanings of words are often rooted in the kinds of sounds that we can make, and the kinds of sounds that we can make are determined by all of these things like our anatomy and the environment that we're in. Just as another example, he talks about languages that emerge in warmer climates tend to have more vowels.
Hmm.
And the explanation seems to be that, like, because it's warmer, people are outside more. And so they're speaking to one another across more space. And vowels can carry more effectively than consonants. So
It's fascinating.
cold climates where people are sort of huddled together inside, you have very consonant heavy languages. In warm climates, you have these vowel heavy languages. And, I mean, it's just stuff that I wouldn't typically think about. I just found that super interesting.
No, I love that kind of thing. Yes, because in a million years, it would not have occurred to me like that might be the case. I mean, the question wouldn't have entered my mind. So that I love that kind of thing. So there's a lot of interesting details in this book. Mithen talks about the distinction between so-called arbitrary words and iconic words. So arbitrary words are just like regular words where there's no connection between what the word sounds like and what it refers to, which is most words, right? So in English, we say dog, referring to the animal that barks and wags its tail, but there's nothing to connect the sound dog with an actual dog, and nor is there a connection. I mean, chien in French also doesn't evoke, right? So that's why they're called arbitrary words. In contrast to so-called iconic words, of which the best known example is onomatopoeia. These are words, for example, like bang or quack, that sound like the thing they represent. So what, right? But Mithen believes that iconic words played an important role in the evolution of language because they sort of bridge this gap between, as he puts it, the barks and grunts of our, chimpanzee-like ancestors hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years ago, versus modern language today. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I found that super interesting. And there's more of language has this quality than we often think about. And he talks about like synesthesia, right? Which is
Mhm.
like where different sensory modalities kind of get cross-wired. But really, like, we all have this. Like, you see something and you hear a sound, and then from then on you associate, the sight and the sound or things like that. So there's also like, okay, you could have onomatopoeia where, bang sounds like, is the word for a sound and sounds
Yeah.
like it. But you could also have something like the word ball, where you're really making like a round shape
Yeah.
with your mouth
Yes.
and
With your
then
tongue.
kind
Yes.
of
Yeah.
closing it off with the L sound at the end. And so you're sort of creating
Yeah.
like a sphere. And
Yeah.
then balloon, right, is like
Yeah.
balloon, right? It's like you're
Yeah.
expanding a
Oh, that's
ball. So
interesting.
it's getting the
Yeah.
sphere. And so there's all these things like that. And there's a number of variations of this, but I know the neuroscientist Ramachandran did one version of this where you show people these two shapes, and
Yeah.
one is very, very rounded and the other is very spiky. And you say, one of these is named Kiki and one is Baba, which is
Yeah.
which? And like 95% of people will say
Yeah.
that the spiky one is Kiki and the rounded one is Baba,
Yeah.
because the words themselves are, the shapes that you make with your mouth and your tongue
Yeah.
are rounded versus spiky. And then there's a lot of things like this, like, you, when I say, hey, you is sort of with your lips, you're sort of pointing outward at the,
That's
person
interesting.
you're speaking
Yeah.
to. When you say me, the M sound like brings your lips, like you're pointing inward to yourself. And this works in a
Yeah.
lot of languages. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
things like this. And I actually, when I first started playing with ChatGPT, and people are talking about, like, is ChatGPT really using language or not?
Yeah.
I decided to try to give it one of these types of.
Oh yeah, because you love stumping the
It is.
AIs. I
It's
know
like
we've
like a
a hobby
favorite
of yours.
hobby
Yeah.
of mine
Yeah.
to try to stump ChatGPT.
Yeah.
But I was thinking, like, if language is really embodied in this way, and ChatGPT is not, using a mouth, then it's not going to say the things that we would say about language. So I asked it. I had to come up with a new one because I thought if I did like Kiki and Baba or
It'll
whatever,
just look it
it
up.
might
Yeah.
find it on
Yeah.
the
It'll
internet.
find it.
So,
Yeah.
um, so I came up with here. I have the transcript here. I said, imagine someone presents you with two newly invented words, pew, P-E-W, pew. Is that already a word? That is a word,
That's
isn't it?
already a word.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I said pew and bra, B-R-A-H.
Okay.
And I said one of them means huge and one means tiny. Which one do you think is which and why? So what would you say, Dan?
Um, yeah, I don't want to get this wrong or it'll be embarrassing, but I think bra just seems bigger and expansive. Pew, I mean, first of all, it sounds like the English word puny, which means small, but also, it's the laser effect from Star Wars, pew pew, and those are kind of, they're focused on a point, they're kind of just these linear. So I don't know. I'm going to go with bra is bigger and pew is smaller.
Yeah, so that was my thought too. And I
Thank
think
God.
most
Thank
people
God.
would say that
Okay.
just based on like what you're doing with your mouth. So ChatGPT said, based solely on the sound, I would guess that pew means huge and bra means tiny. The word pew, this is ChatGPT's rationale.
Yeah.
The word pew reminds me of few, which is used to express relief or amazement after a big effort. On the other hand, bra sounds like a shortened version of micro or nano. I don't know how that makes
Where did it
sense.
get that from?
Which are
What was it
prefixes
smoking?
used to indicate smallness or tininess.
Yeah.
So that was the answer. So yeah, I think the point is just that having particular anatomy, having a particular embodied experience in the world might actually shape the meanings of words more than we often think. The other example Mithen gave that I really liked was the word mumble, right? Like
Oh,
you
yeah.
kind of have
That's a
to
great word.
mumble to say mumble.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, that's a really good example. Yeah. I was going to say that the ChatGPT, the first half of the ChatGPT answer before it started talking out of its ass, um, was very impressive for a mindless piece of zeros and
Yeah,
ones
fair.
putting sort of, that was incredibly impressive. And then even though it disagreed, but it had a reason for why it disagreed. And then unfortunately the second half was rubbish. But so it's a longish book, but it is so rich with examples of interesting things that you didn't even know you were fascinated by or about until you encounter them. So I'll just give one little example. He's talking about how words evolve and how we adapt, take words and give them new meanings and that sort of thing. Of course, we do it unconsciously. We just do it. We don't think about it. So he talks about how the word field originally meant like a field of wheat or whatever, but then now we use it for field of study or field of vision. And you don't even have to know that it originally meant field of wheat or that other people still use it to mean that. It's just so fluid that we can do that. And then here's one that I just never thought of. He says, similarly, we use the word broadcaster about a radio or TV presenter without needing to appreciate that this is ultimately a metaphorical use of the 18th century word for scattering seed. Now, I guess when we think of broadcaster, caster, like casting to cast off, to cast the villain into the volcano or something. So I get the part about casting. And then broad, I'm guessing broad is related to bread, but he doesn't say that. So I'll have to Google that sometime. But at any rate, I find these kinds of things fascinating that the word broadcaster or broadcasting comes from something, from centuries ago when it feels like a word that was just made up in the 1950s. So
Yeah,
I
it's
love that kind of
amazing.
thing. My favorite example, I don't think Mython mentions this, but just in terms of expressions that you would forget came from a very specific thing long ago, there are many of these in writing, so when you look at your computer keyboard, you see things like return. Well, why the hell is it called return? So it's called return because it used to be a carriage return. What the hell's a carriage? Computers don't have carriages, but typewriters did, right? Old manual typewriters and possibly electric typewriters had that part that literally moved from left to right as you typed. If you think about this, right? The spot where the keys strike the ribbon, that doesn't move, which means the paper has to move. Well, how is the paper moving? If the paper is attached to a carriage, sorry, this is all like anybody older than middle age already knows this intimately, but the youngins may not appreciate this. Um, so anyway, that's why it's called a carriage return, and then that got shortened to return. That's fine, but I'm guessing it wasn't called a carriage return until the invention of typewriters. I could be wrong about that. So that makes it about 150 years old, maybe.
And
But
probably
but
carriage, carriage probably came from a carriage, right?
possibly because it moves, right?
It
Because it moves.
moves.
But my favorite example that people use, of course, without thinking about, is uppercase and lowercase. And those are many centuries old. Those terms go back to Gutenberg and having a tray of capital letters and a tray of lower, okay, so a tray of capital letters and a tray of non-capital regular letters, and one was up there and you had to reach up for it, and one was down here and you reached down for it, and that's why they're called uppercase. And it was a case. It was like a little case. So I love that kind
The
of
only
thing.
one I ever actually think about is the escape button, because I always picture like it's gonna like fling me out of my chair if I
I
push
love
it.
that. That could be useful sometimes. So do you know where that comes from?
I don't. I don't. And I guess one last thing it's worth pointing out is, Mython says something, I believe he says there's 7,000 languages currently.
Yeah, yeah.
I think he said something like there's like been 500,000 since people were talking. I don't know how they calculate that number,
And
but
we're down to 7,000.
we're down to
Yeah.
7,000. I mean, there are like many, many thousands of dialects within those
Yes.
7,000, but most of those 7,000 languages are spoken by very, very, very small groups of people. So, um,
Yeah.
and he says, I think only 500 of those 7,000 are actually like fully documented. And so as we lose
Yeah.
those languages, we lose all these links that we're talking about that sort of are evidence in and of themselves of like the evolution of language. And so
Yeah.
even just from a purely scientific perspective, let alone, like a cultural perspective, it's so sad to watch these languages go extinct because you just lose part of the story.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's so much in this book. Again, it's around 400 pages, something like that, but it won't surprise listeners to hear that there's mountains of endnotes. But not only that, the bibliography is about 50 pages long. That's staggering. And you can say, oh, well, he overdid it. Maybe you don't need to give that many sources. But I just love it when authors actually do give you that, because there are going to be folks who are going to read this and actually want to learn a bit more and go to some of the original studies. So even though it's not exactly aimed at academics, it's aimed at regular folks, people like us. It is for the average interested reader, but it is so thoroughly done and so detailed. So, and there are little things people might want to quibble with, and maybe people think that either chimps or Neanderthals are smarter or dumber than Mithen says they are, but there's just so much in here. So I do recommend this book. Again, the title is The Language Puzzle, and the author is Steven Mithen. So, Amanda, what's on your nightstand?
On my nightstand is a book called Ways of Being: Animals, Plants, Machines, and the Search for a Planetary Intelligence by James Bridle. Bridle is a British artist and writer who now lives in Greece. Bridle's pronouns are they, them, and this is their second book. It's a really interesting book. It covers just a huge amount of ground, but it really starts from the idea that historically, the way we've defined intelligence, or the way science has defined intelligence, is sort of just like whatever humans do. It's a very human-centric idea. And so Bridle wants to sort of show us the ways in which that has become problematic and kind of move us to thinking in terms of what they call the more than human world, which is a phrase that comes from the philosopher and ecologist David Abram, whose work I'm sure I've talked about many times on BookLab, because Abram has written some of my favorite books, including Becoming Animal and The Spell of the Sensuous. So Bridle starts this book talking about an experiment that was done with gibbons. And it's an experiment that goes back to like the early 1900s, where they basically give the gibbons a task to try to, get a snack using a stick. So it's kind of like a tool use. Can they solve a slightly complex problem that involves, using a tool? And other primates like chimps and orangutans had completed this task with no problem, but gibbons couldn't do it. But in every other aspect, the gibbons seemed just as intelligent as the other primates. So it was like this weird mystery of like, well, I guess they're just not that intelligent, but why? And in some of these, it's like they have to pull on a stick. In some versions, they have to tug on a string that the food is tied to. But the stick and the string were always on the ground in all of these versions of the experiment. And in 1967, experimenters decided to change the design of the experiment by hanging the strings from the top of the enclosure. And all of a sudden, the gibbons could do it. No problem. And so Bridle writes, in one swift motion, the gibbons suddenly became intelligent, according, that is, to the narrow definition of the scientific method. And so it was just like a nice example of like, gibbons spend all their time in trees. Their attention is oriented upward. Yeah. And not only their attention, but their hands, the actual shape of their hands is oriented in a way for them to grab things that are above. And so the sticks and strings on the ground just like wasn't their way of interacting with the world. And there's another great example I was thinking of with these like New Caledonian crows, I believe, where they could complete a task where like I think there's like bugs in a bottle, and if they use this, they can like hold a stick in their beak and try to stick it into the bottle and get at the bugs. And it was like some birds could do it. These birds could do it, but other birds couldn't. Unless I have this wrong and it's the reverse. But the idea was like researchers kept saying like, well, they must have some cognitive ability in the brain to like analyze this task or whatever. And then what it turned out was just like certain birds, like their eyes are too far on the sides of their heads. They can't like visually guide a stick that's, directly in front of them into a bottle. And so it was just like the shape of their body was the issue. And it's the same with the gibbons. So yeah, it was just a nice example of like, when we try to think about intelligence and like, is a plant intelligent? Is a computer intelligent? Do we really mean, does it have human intelligence? Because that would be weird. Why would it have human intelligence? It's not a human, right? Like Monica Gagliano, who's featured in this book, she was sort of like just astounded by the idea that like we are more willing to say that computers are intelligent than we are to say that plants are intelligent, when plants are like living things that we are biologically related to, and computers are like objects that we made, which I think is a fair point. I mean, she's done these fascinating experiments that Bridle talks about, showing that plants can do like associative learning, that they seem to have memory. And there's all kinds of things that plants can do. They can tell, strangers from kin. They can make sort of spur of the moment decisions as to whether to like, prioritize getting water versus getting sunlight, et cetera. There's just like much more that they can do. She's shown just these amazing things like, she played like recordings of the sound of water to plants, and they like moved in the direction of the recordings. Wow. But yeah, I mean, these are just very thorny questions, and Bridle kind of goes into all of this. I mean, one of the things they talk about is how we can use technology to see intelligence that may not be like visible to us usually. So for like a simple example, using time lapse. So Bridle describes these like doing like time lapse like satellite images and watching. You can like sort of watch like, or do a computer model or something and watch the whole planet as if it's on fast forward. And Bridle says we see, quote, mangrove forests walking up and down the Australian coast, which I just love that image because, you don't think of that.
Well, I mean, there's a danger that you'll think that Lord of the Rings imagery will be the thing that you think, because we know that from the movies. But nonetheless, I mean, I've seen mangrove swamps in Florida. They're kind of amazing. They're, for anyone who may not be familiar, they're trees whose roots jut up out of the water. I mean, all trees have roots, but mangrove roots are partly in the water and partly in the air. So it's almost like the trees are on stilts. Quite amazing, really.
Yeah. And there have been experiments with pea plants, like climbing peas, using time-lapse photography, where if you sort of watch in real time what these climbing peas are doing, and basically it's like a situation where you have a pole and you have the pea plant growing, and its goal is to wrap around the pole. And And if you just watch like in real time, it's like every day it's in a slightly different position and whatever. And it doesn't seem like anything's happening, or if it does, it seems like something very random is happening. But when you watch on fast forward, you actually see it sort of the plant circles around the pole. And then the minute it senses it, taps it, it stops circling. It like leans back and then sort of flings itself like a lasso and wraps itself around the pole. And so it looks like animal intelligent behavior when you see it at the right time scale. So, and there are obviously like many examples. So Bridle talks about like using technology to try to converse with animals, understand animal language and things like that. So there's all these ways in which we want to ask, like, is the technology intelligent? Are the plants intelligent? Are the animals intelligent? But then there's some sense in which like the intelligence sort of arises like when you put them all together and you sort of see these new things. And I guess in a sense, like that is the overriding theme of the book, I would say, is this idea that like maybe intelligence is not something that happens in any one of us, but in relation, which is also an idea that Bridle takes very much from David Abram. And one of the ways that this comes out in Bridle's book, for example, talking about like animal communication, right? We could say, oh, let me take recordings of, dolphins making all of these noises and then try to run it through some program that can find patterns and try to decode it. And like, and basically the idea is like, what are the dolphins saying, right? Or you can give an animal like a primate sort of human-centric language tasks to see if they can do it. Like, can they learn human language? But Bridle sort of says there's also kind of a third option, which is what happens when we communicate with animals. And Bridle goes walking with like shepherds who are talking to their flocks, and people who use birds as like hunting guides, and they make like certain bird calls, and then the birds call back that tells them where to go, because they kind of have the symbiotic relationship where the bird gets some of the winnings. And so there's something in that like is communication that's actually, and I think pet owners know this really well, right? Like, I don't speak dog. My dog doesn't speak English really, but we communicate all the time. And it's really like there's something in between. And so I think what Bridle's trying to get at is like, that's where intelligence lies. And what becomes interesting is like when we think about technology, for instance, then the question becomes not like, is the large language model intelligent, but it's like, is our interaction with these things intelligent? And so one of the ways that Bridle talks about machines becoming more intelligent is to actually have machines that interact with the world more than they do. It's like Bridle talks about like soft robotics. And the key point there is like, you don't want to just think about machines that are making models of the world. And so Bridle writes, to make a model is to abstract and represent. It's an act of distancing from the world. But the world is already here. It's right in front of us. We are suspended within it and soaked in it. We are inseparable from it. The machines we need for making sense of this omnipresent, efflorescent, and entangled world, where making sense is analogous, as Wittgenstein said of language, to joining in play, should not be more remote, more abstract, but more like the world. And in the backwoods of computer history, connected to the information superhighway, but far enough away that you can hear the birds and see the stars again, people have been thinking about and building such machines for quite some time. And then Bridle goes into this whole history of computer technology and Alan Turing's ideas about the oracle, which is like kind of a intelligent machine that can then reach out to something beyond itself. And Bridle talks about cybernetics and all of these things. And so, so the big idea again is just like intelligence is something that happens in relation, but that, that's hard for humans, and it's hard for the scientific method. Like, I think this is what came up in the blind spot to really grasp. And so it requires like a kind of shift in thinking that Bridle's like urging us to make in order to deal with things like climate change and stuff. So it's a big, sweeping, very interesting book.
Yeah, some of that sounds familiar just in the sense that, I have heard different people arguing about some of these things. So we were talking about large language models, and that one often hears, well, the reason they're bumbling and stumbling is because they don't really understand anything about the world. They understand patterns of words and sentences, like the reason they can write a sonnet in the style of Shakespeare is because they've ingested 100 or what I don't remember how many sonnets Shakespeare wrote, but they ingest them all, and then they sort of understand the likelihood of one word to be followed by another word, and then they can write a sonnet about hamburgers, but in the style of Shakespeare. That's fine, but they don't understand that human bodies take up space. They don't understand that if you let go of a hammer, it'll move downward. They don't know what down is,
Right.
right? And they don't know what to be extended in space is, and they certainly don't know that time is no. Well, I mean, I wrote a book about look, there are a lot of professional scholars who also struggle to understand what time is, but at least we have some vague idea. Um, and we know that an internet search that took place a week ago is not going to contain information about things that happened yesterday. So you and I know that because it's obvious, but for an entity that just has no awareness of like space and time, these things are challenging. And so one, I don't know if you'd call it a solution, but one idea that has been often suggested is, well, let's give them bodies. Well, you know what I mean? Like embed the computer in whatever, a robot, or yeah. So that's very interesting. But I guess the question I want to ask you is, because if I recall, the title or the subtitle of Bridle's book involves the planet. So perhaps we all remember the Gaia hypothesis that James Lovelock put forward however many decades ago. And I'm just wondering, and that's always been, although provocative, a little bit kind of controversial, a little bit off the mainstream. So does Bridle somewhat embrace, Gaia-like ideas?
Yeah, so Bridle talks briefly about Gaia theory. Bridle calls the Earth like the ultimate homeostat, right? Like a
Mm.
homeostatic device is a device that's like self-regulating in some way. Um, and so the Gaia theory, talks about the entire planet as being like a self-regulating system in a similar way to how perhaps like a cell or a living creature is a self-regulating system. And I think I think the name Gaia like was never a great branding. I think
Yeah,
this is
yeah,
like come to be considered somewhat of like a woo-woo idea on the fringe, but actually like there is a lot of like just good science involved. It's sort of like a shame that people have, cast this off to the fringes. So Bridle, yeah, talks about if the planet is kind of like this ultimate self-regulating system, that we are enmeshed in this huge web of relations that all like feed back on each other in like these very complicated ways that can either be self-sustaining or self-destructive. And like, in the case of climate change, we've obviously moved into like a self-destructive phase that we need to to pull back or, risk our own lives. But Bridle, yeah, like talks about Gaia briefly and in a positive way, and actually in the context of computer science. And so that's like an interesting connection. And sort of again saying, Bridle wants to say the world is not like a computer, but computers are like the world, or rather, computers are part of the world. And there's a lot about that in the book that's just it's really fascinating. Yeah, all of these things are covered in this very ambitious book, and I think it's these are ideas that are really worth thinking about. I think Bridle draws a lot from ideas of various people who it's worth looking at their kind of original ideas as well. So, for example, like the Gaian hypothesis, looking at like Lovelock and Lynn Margulis and
mm.
David Abram, who, many, many ideas in this book are taken from, and also people like Monica Gagliano, who's doing plant intelligence, who is just fascinating. And if in the end, your way of thinking about intelligence takes on this more relational quality, I think that's a good thing for all of us. So again, the book is Ways of Being, and the author is James Bridle. So Dan, what's on your nightstand?
So on my nightstand is a really interesting book called Playing Possum: How Animals Understand Death by Susana Monsó. Monsó is a philosopher at the National Distance Education University in Madrid, Spain. Um, it's one of those books where from the title, I thought, yeah, like I want to read, without knowing if it's good or bad, I want to read this book. And also, why didn't someone write this book 30 years ago?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just one of these like if you've ever been to the zoo, and even if you haven't been to the zoo, this is just something that you wonder about, right? Humans, I mean, it's fun being a human being, but we are plagued with this knowledge that we're going to die. And by the way, that sucks, right? But what about our animal companions and wild animals? I mean, that's so I'll get into that in a minute. I also want to say, we usually don't worry too much about like cover designs, but the cover is excellent. I'll just describe it very briefly. There are two possums, but they're like, they're cartoon possums, right? So there's a possum walking from right to left, but then reflected about the x-axis, therefore underneath him, or him or her, underneath the possum is another identical possum, as though the original possum is at the edge of a lake, right? So you're seeing the possum and the reflected possum, and they're identical, except the upper possum is alive and the lower possum is dead. And the lower possum is dead because they have an X where their eye would be, right? So it's just this minimalist but perfect cover design. And
it's
I had
like
to check.
Schrodinger's possum.
Right, yeah, exactly, right. And the design, I had to check this jacket illustration by Joanna. I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, but Joanna Groshoka. So kudos to Joanna for a perfect cover. Now, Monsó goes through a bunch of things, which I'm just going to sort of give a little summary version of. So you were talking, Amanda, about the danger of measuring all intelligences relative to human intelligence and why it's just a trap one doesn't want to fall into. So, in a similar vein, Monsó warns about certain kinds of biases that have sort of stood in the way of perhaps explaining why someone hasn't gotten around to writing this book until now. So, anthropocentrism is like an obvious one, and the tendency to sort of view everything from a human perspective. An interesting example of that is that there's been a lot of studies on grief and looking at our closer chimpanzees, bonobos, our closer primate cousins, and so this looks like grief, or this behavior doesn't look as much like grief as that other behavior. And this is a bit subtle because I mean, there's nothing wrong with carrying out studies like that, but as she points out, first of all, there's this tendency to weirdly compare animal grief to human grief, but why should we expect it to be the same? And then perhaps even more importantly, there's this weird thing that, oh, this grieving behavior that is about death is more important than this other non-grieving behavior because grieving is something that we can relate to, right? So that's another trap, right? It is a bit weird. I mean, so I sort of understand why we do it. Like, it's easier to get funding for a study for something that is relatable, but it is weird to privilege grief over other types of reactions just because humans grieve, if you see what I mean. So
Yeah, there's also like a sense in which like we have such because grief is such a powerful emotion for us, we have like such empathy when we think we're seeing grief in another
mhm, mhm,
animal, right? So like maybe
mhm.
that's like a good thing in a way, like we want to empathize, but there's like you see, I don't know, maybe this is just me, but it's like you see the elephant, grieving over its baby or something, and it's like, oh, like it's so heartbreaking to,
Yes,
the
yes,
chimp carrying
yes,
around its
yes.
baby or something.
And as powerful as those, videos that go around from time to time are, they immediately raise, well, so what if the animal didn't have human-like attributes or human-like behaviors? Then would we just dismiss it and say, well, then who cares, right? So
Hmm.
these things are very tricky. So that was anthropocentrism. There's anthropomorphism, which is that sort of the tendency to bestow on an animal or any other entity that's non-human, as could apply to computers or AIs, with a human quality that it may lack. Um, but and this is I found this interesting. There's also the opposite problem, which I didn't even know what it was called, but apparently it's called anthropectomy. Bit of a mouthful there,
Hmm.
and perhaps this will. I don't know if this is really caught on or if it's doomed to not really catch on. But anthropectomy is the mistaken denial of a human-like characteristic that an animal may actually possess, but the researcher just assumes that it doesn't. And as she writes, both mistakes are equally serious, and there is no reason to fear one over the other. They are both false descriptions of reality. So let me just give a couple of specific examples. So, as I think listeners to this podcast know, there's something called the problem of other minds, right? So it is, we sort of assume our fellow humans are conscious and experiencing different stuff similar to things that we ourselves have experienced. And of course, humans can talk. So if you're not sure if your friend is okay, you say, "Hey, Bob, are you okay?" Now, of course, they might not give a truthful answer, but at least you can try to get you get part way towards knowing what your friends and family members are feeling. This is much harder to do with non-human animals because they don't talk well. As per what you've been saying in your nightstand piece, I mean, they don't use our language, right? So it's just challenging. Although, as you pointed out correctly, I mean, I think any dog owner, has some connection to their dog and probably vice versa too in terms of anyway. But an example that comes up early in the book is the case of ants, and I found this quite fascinating. So ants will remove a dead ant from their nest. I don't know, I think nest and colony are perhaps not exact synonyms, so I'm calling them nests because that's the wording that she uses. But the interesting thing is the ants appear to be merely responding to a chemical emitted by the corpse, something called oleic acid. The interesting thing is they've tested this. So researchers have been able to put a little drop of oleic acid on a live ant, and guess what? The other ants treat it as though it's dead. And here I can't help thinking of like the Monty Python skit where, the guy's being thrown on the play card. I'm not dead yet. So I picture it as being like that. It's probably not exactly that, but yes, these poor ants, and especially the one that has the oleic acid dripped onto it, they just say, "Oh, it's like, oh, dead ant here. Time to, get the wagon. This guy's heading out. Time to expel Bob from the nest." Um, so again, so what's the point of all this? So the point is that clearly some of this is just happening on autopilot. I mean, it doesn't, you could say, oh, well, that doesn't prove it, but this suggests that at least this behavior is just something that can be controlled chemically and does not necessarily involve, shall we say, a deep understanding of
Although
death.
it would be funny if you could get the aunt's perspective and they were like, "Oh my God, like Bob's alive, but he's like emitting death odor. Like that can't be good. Like let's get him out of here."
No, absolutely, right? Or Bob has committed the unforgivable faux pas of making
Right.
contact with death mojo molecules. As Bob very well knew, the punishment for that is permanent exile. So these are these are good points. Um, so Monsó contrasts this with, say, chimpanzees. Now, of course, chimpanzees are much closer evolutionarily to us. So what happens when a chimpanzee dies? And I'm actually not sure if this study that I'm about to mention was carried out in captivity or in the wild, but at any rate, researchers watched what happens when a particular chimpanzee and a particular there's this group of chimpanzees died, and many of the other chimps sort of either didn't react, like sat around the body of the deceased chimp, observing it in silence. Some of them gave alarm calls. That's kind of interesting. I mean, I guess as though suggesting a measure of distress, perhaps. Others reacted aggressively, some of them even attacking the remains. But anyway, so all of this stuff is more complex than what we saw with the ants, right? But also in this particular study, as Monsó notes, there were two particular chimpanzees. I think they're a mother and daughter who had been close to the chimp that died. I don't recall their biological connection, but they had been close to the chimp that died, and these two chimps remained close to the corpse after other chimpanzees had gotten bored and moved on.
Aw.
Um, and she says these are examples of cognitive reactions. So as opposed with the more autopilot thing that happens with the ants, she calls those stereotypical reactions. Anyway, I mean, the labels aren't the issue here, but it's just interesting that there is a world of difference between how an ant treats a dead ant. I mean, for starters, they're not even sure. They're like, yeah, well, it looks like Bob's dead. What are you gonna do? Like, we kind of seems like he's dead. Whereas the chimpanzees, it's this whole big, kind of production, right? Which is highly variable from one individual to another. Another really interesting example. So again, the book was called Playing Possum. So opossums famously play dead. That's a thing they do to discourage to survive an attack. They play dead, and then the predator doesn't eat them. So she points out that the opossum likely doesn't understand that it's playing dead. It's just acting out an evolved response in a, similar to the ants carrying the dead ant out of the nest. But there's more to it than that, because you're probably wondering, well, like, where does, for it to be a survival advantage, it has to confer. So what is the advantage? What is the thing that's being selected for? This is where it gets interesting. So she's pointing out that the predator must have some conception of death in order to choose not to eat the dead seeming opossum. And I guess, I don't know if this is exactly how Monsó phrases it, but it's something to the effect of, oh, well, look at this. I was chasing, I'm feeling hungry. I was chasing this opossum, but I see now that I've made a mistake. It's a dead opossum, and dead opossums can carry disease. And Fred ate a dead opossum, and things didn't go. He was barfing for like a week, and he got really sick. So I am going to leave what I thought this was a delicious opossum, but it looks like it's dead. I'm going to leave it alone. And by the way, yes, I know I'm being silly. And as we were earlier with the ants, we're not imagining that there's this deep level, meta cognitive analysis. But I did find this quite interesting because it suggests, and again, it doesn't prove that the predator has a very deep level of understanding about, woe is me, I'm getting old, I'm probably going to die one day. But it seems to it seems to have evolved this ability to distinguish the alive from dead opossums. And it's fascinating that as opossums evolved, the opossums that were better at pretending to be dead were more successful at passing their genes on to the next generation of opossums. And over time, these opossums just became better and better actors until they could play dead really well. So I thought that was really interesting. And at the risk of, maybe giving away the ending, because I think this is kind of a fun book. In spite of sort of about death, but still kind of a fun read. And I think people will enjoy it. She does suspect, this is very difficult to prove, but she does suspect that there are aspects of understanding death that are unique to our species. Although, again, since you were talking about LLMs and AIs in your nightstand piece, Amanda, it'd be interesting if the robots of the future do have, it's tricky because at the moment robots don't exactly die. Again,
they're like, oh my God, Bob was turned off.
Yeah, exactly, right? So some things that may be uniquely human are this idea of the inevitability of death. So it's one thing, again, the chimpanzees recognize that their fellow chimpanzee has died, but it would be quite a leap to understand that death is an inevitable thing. Like it's not just like, Bob happened to croak, but like it was inevitable. I'm sad that he croaked now, but it was inevitable that he was eventually going to croak. That's quite, that's a kind of advanced as it were, thought. And then, of course, that it applies to oneself, right? And then another item on top of all those is that, in general, it's an unpredictable thing. So you've got this kind of triple whammy. Everybody dies. I'm a subset of everyone, so I'm going to die, and I don't know when it's going to happen. And that last one, I guess the movie reference here would be Logan's Run, right? In Logan's Run, mandatory death happens at 30, if I'm remembering the plot correctly, and I think that would be horrible. But of course, any fixed date would be horrible, right? So yeah, it's kind of weird that you don't know when you're going to go, but of course it'd be worse if you knew, right?
Totally.
And I think I was reading one of you got me reading Borges' short stories from the book Labyrinth, and there's one where the condemned criminal is anyway. None of this matters other than you if you're a literature person, you can get a lot of mileage out of impending death. So what do animals think about death? Well, it's a nuanced, there's no one answer to that. There's a lot of partial answers. And as I said, there may be some elements of how entities understand death that are unique to our own species. But it's fascinating to read about what we've come to understand about how other animals think about death. So there's a lot. It's not a very long book, but every chapter is kind of really interesting. There's a lot to think about. There's a lot to continue to think about after you finish reading the book. So I do recommend this one. Again, the title is Playing Possum, and the author is Susana Monsó. You've been listening to episode 38 of BookLab. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and on SoundCloud, And we're also starting to make our episodes available on YouTube, so going forward, you can look for us there as well. Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/BookLabPodcast, and do look for Amanda and myself on your favorite social media platforms, including Blue Sky.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on BookLab.